I was born in Arkansas, a place called Bradford, Arkansas, in August the 2nd, 1930.
Are you an only child?
Say again?
Were you an only child? Do you have any siblings?
I had a total of 3 of us boys and 3 girls.
Oh wow, so six altogether.
Yes. My mother had twins, but they took them too early, not knowing that she was going to have twins. They just thought she was ready for birth, and they took them early, and they both died, a boy and a girl. So there would have been 4 boys and 4 girls.
Oh my goodness.
But after they didn't make it, the oldest one lived a little over a day.
I'm very sorry to hear that. I don't want you to have to go through that.
I
So you grew up.
graduated from Bradford High School in 1950.
And what were you? So you enlisted into what branch?
Air Force.
The Air Force. What made you decide to enlist?
I decided to enlist, at which time I was employed with the Chevrolet place in Flint, Michigan. And I decided to enlist because I didn't want to be drafted into the Army. I wanted the Air Force.
You knew it was coming.
I had an older brother in the Air Force. And I also had a younger brother that also joined the Air Force. So there was 3 of us at one time in the Air Force, 3 brothers. I had 3 sisters, all younger than me. And I had, after graduating from high school in Bradford, I went to work at the Chevrolet place in Flint, Michigan. And I was employed there for about 3 months and learned that I had a good chance to join the Air Force instead of being drafted. So I quit to come home and join the Air Force.
So you knew the draft was coming. Had a lot of your friends been drafted, or people that you've known?
Some of the boys at Bradford High School had been drafted already. And so I decided I wanted to get in the Air Force while my brother was in the Air Force, oldest brother.
While you could decide.
Right, and he went in as an enlisted man and got his master sergeant's rank and decided he wanted to go and get his commission. And so he went to school to be a commissioned officer, got his 2nd lieutenant's rank, and then he, when he retired with, I believe it was 21 years service, he was a captain. So he got his commissioned officer's rank and was promoted through captain's rank. When I got in, I had the option to go to school. The Air Force sent me to College of Aeronautics in Santa Maria, California, at Hancock Field. And when I graduated from there, I had majored in electrical. After getting my airplane engine mechanic school, well, I decided, and they offered me a chance to take more school, so I went to Chanutfield, Illinois, at Rantoul, where they put me in electrical training for, I think, about 4.5 months. And then, of course, I had already been at Eglin Field, Florida, which was an experimental air base.
What do you mean?
B-36s.
What do you mean by experimental?
They were using the B-36 to practice bombing with in the Eglin Field area. And they would drop bombs that had sand in it and just enough explosive to blow it up. And they were like 3 feet in diameter and probably about 30 feet long. They were huge bombs. And they never were used in the war. the B-36 was never used in the war. From there, from Eglinfield, Florida, I went to Wichita Falls, Texas. And their school was full up there. Airplane engine school was full up. And so that's when they sent me to Santa Maria for mechanic school. And like I said, as I completed that, well then, they had offered me to go ahead and get my electrical training if I wanted it, so I told them I'd take it. And after graduating in Chinookville, Illinois, on the electrical, they sent me to debarkation at Camp Stoneman, California.
Yeah, you moving all over the place, didn't they?
Yes, ma'am. And then,
About what time is this by now? What year?
That was about 51.
This is 1951? Okay. And you
Early
enlisted,
part of 51.
and you enlisted in 1950 right after you graduated, is that right? Okay, just making sure.
And they cut me records for going overseas. And I thought I was going to Korea, but I ended up on Okinawa.
So you knew what was going on in Korea. You knew that
Yeah.
there was a war going on. When did you first hear about Korea?
I first heard about Korea when I was working at the Chevrolet place in Flint, Michigan. And I decided that there was a lot of boys getting killed in the Army and all. And so I decided it would be smart to join the Air Force and try to go to school.
Yeah.
So I had got all of my school, and they had me at Camp Stoneman for debarkation, and I boarded the General Walker and went by water to be in the Korean conflict.
How many days did it take you to reach Korea?
It took us about 2 weeks,
2 weeks. And
roughly.
what were you eating while on your way to Korea? Like, how were the living conditions as far as food and sleeping?
While we was on the boat, on the ship, we had real good food. The people took good care of us, feeding us. We had about any kind of food that you would have anywhere. And one day off of Okinawa, I believe that they let me know that we was going to dock the ship at Okinawa. So got off the ship, and the Air Force picked me up in a 6x, they call them 6x trucks. And we got on, me and other airmen got on the 6x, and they took us to Kadena Air Base, which was the main, if not the only air base that the United States had on Okinawa in 1950.
And at this
51.
time, what was your specialty?
My specialty was a mechanic. I was an airplane engine mechanic, and I was also an airplane electrical.
What is that?
You do electrical maintenance on the airplane. When it lands, the pilot will write in his logbook if it has a problem. And you read the logbook every morning when you go to work, the troublesheet. And if one of the B-29s has a problem, we would go out to the hard stand where the B-29 was located and go to work on it. And we worked out of what they call the specialist shop, electrician specialist shop on the B-29s. We did a little bit of mechanic work, but mainly my work was electrical. If the pilot, when they would go to the Republic of Korea to do their bomb runs, they would sometimes have trouble. They might get hit with a little bit of flak, but we flew at night. pilots opted to do their night flying. And they would drop tinfoil out of a chute, and the Koreans, North Koreans, their radar would pick that tinfoil up, and so their artillery would hit the tinfoil and explode at that altitude, and the pilot that's flying the Superfortress would be maybe up 1,000 feet higher. So sometimes he would get hit with a little bit of flak from the explosion. But because of the night raids and the jamming, the radar jamming that we did from the plane, by dropping the tinfoil, we threw our artillery off, and so it would explode on the tinfoil that we were dropping out. It was a big roll, a tape roll of tinfoil, and drop it out of chute and hang on to the end of it. It would just unroll down in there immediately, you know. And they were dropping that quite frequently. And so all their artillery was automatically picking this up. They couldn't see us. And
It's pretty smart.
that's the reason for doing the night flying. Because they could, even though we'd do a day raid most of the while, but we'd get hit a little bit maybe. But they still had their guns probably on automatic, their artillery. And when they shoot, well, their automation would pick up the roll of tinfoil floating around in the air. So they was missing us a lot. We never got a direct hit while I was there.
Wow.
We had one or two planes that got hit bad enough to land in Edosuke, Japan for repairs, but they never knocked one of them out. Sometimes we'd have an engine failure or something like that, but the B-29 Superfortress had 4 engines, and they could get in on 2. We had one plane that couldn't retract its landing light, and the landing light was like 8 inches in diameter, and it, best I remember, it had 1,000 watts per light, and the aircraft commander called back and said he couldn't get his landing light to come up on one side, and so he was given permission to salvo his bombs in the ocean and come on back, because they didn't know whether that would make them an automatic target or not. But he talked it over with his crew of 12 on the crew. It'd have a pilot and a co-pilot, an engineer, a bombardier, right and left gunner, tail gunner, and it goes on like that. And I think it was 12 crew. But the crew opted to go ahead and fly the mission, and they didn't even get shot at that night. I guess the Koreans thought it was an act of God or something. When they saw that big light up there, they didn't shoot at us at all. It was something that we didn't expect to get by that easy. But he'd come back the next morning, and they had called me down to the runway, and I watched the plane come in. It come in over the ocean, and the light was still on, and it stayed on until he cut the engines off. The prop wash from the engines kept it cool, and flying it kept it cool. They tried to shoot it out, but when they opened the cockpit window, well, they couldn't quite see it, so they had to feather the engine and shoot where they thought that light was, and they had to be careful not to hit the wing. And so they gave up on that. They didn't want to knock a hole in the wing, and possibly injure or bust a fuel tank. But we were real fortunate that we didn't ever get any B-29 knocked out. We would have occasional flak damage, which would maybe damage the aluminum aircraft, just a little.
Mm-hmm.
If the pilot was real fatigued, he may drag his tail skid. It was a tail skid on the back that came down. There was no tail wheel, it had a nose wheel. And they knew that it was unsafe to hit the runway hard with a nose wheel. It had two wheels on the nose that come down all on one strut. And if you hit that too hard, you could knock it out. And so they would come in and flare a little and maybe hit the runway a little hard. And maybe the tail skid would drag. So every time they would drag the tail skid, we would have to change the strut out on the tail skid. And
Tell me about that process. How long did that take you to change that out?
say again?
How long would it take you to fix that and get it changed out?
It took probably about 3 hours because it was hinged and it was about 30 inches long. It was a pretty heavy piece of, the skid was pretty heavy. In case it drug, you could have weight on it and it wouldn't tear it up. But the government required us to change the strut out. And they said it cost the government $500 every time that we had a tail skid drag.
And that was almost every time. Eee.
We did have an occasional pilot's crew and all would come in very tired and fatigued. And they may drag that skid, but they never did knock out a nose wheel, so we was lucky and doing the right thing all the time. And if it didn't drag even very hard, we still had to change it out. $500 didn't seem like a whole lot, and it wasn't a whole lot.
Well, when you're getting paid $50 or $60 a month, though, that's a pretty big gap. So, did you ever engage in any sort of dangerous situations or dangerous predicaments that you come
No,
across?
I had a chance to fly with several missions as spare, and truthfully, I thought that the plane would probably get knocked out and I wanted to come back home, so I wanted to stay there and be able to work on the B-29s. So I never did go, I was never in any danger. No one ever tried to bomb us or nothing. They couldn't get to us.
How?
From Korea, they didn't have the means of reaching Okinawa.
How long were you in Korea?
I was there a year and a half. I think we had about 2 pretty serious typhoons while I was there. Typhoon is it's like a hurricane. Like we get hurricanes here that's got a lot of wind, covers a lot of miles. They were like that, except they're called typhoons on Okinawa. They pack a lot of water, an awful lot of water, because Okinawa was not very wide at that point, and it wasn't a very long island. The width at that point was like 2 miles wide. And so the Air Force AFSC radio would tell us that we was on our own to take cover when the typhoons were coming through. And that's about the only danger I was ever in. But we were in a typhoon-proof barracks, so we weathered it out good. Barracks.
What was your impression of Korea?
When you go to work in the morning, we always hired them to clean our rooms and make our beds up and stuff like that. They didn't want you to do any of that. So we just get up, leave our dirty clothes, go to work. And when we come home in the evening, all of our dirty clothes would be washed and ironed. The beds would be made up. And they did that for a pack of cigarettes a week. So you don't want to be occupied by another country. Of course, they were real good to us, and we didn't have any trouble with them at all. They were Ryukyuan people, they weren't Japs. And they weren't Chinese. But they looked a whole lot like the Japanese people. I went to Suicide Cliff, where during the occupation of the American military, when after the war on Okinawa, which was a horrible war, the Japanese just wouldn't hardly give up. But I did go to Suicide Cliff where this one Japanese general ordered his men to jump to their death over Suicide Cliff. I forget how many of them it was hundreds of them though. And they were taught that America was real mean, and so they wouldn't surrender. There were some of them, not long before I got there, that they had found in those caves, that they were living in the caves on Okinawa, because they were scared of us. And
So they would rather jump to their own death than.
they were pretty obedient to their commanding officers and all that, and they all jumped to their death. It was, some of them they thought was still on Okinawa when I was there, but I never did go up in the northernmost part of Okinawa to find out if there's any of them up there or not. Because we was in the Korean War, not the Japanese War. The Japanese War was all over when I was there.
Mm-hmm. So, I mean, those are obviously some probably unpleasant memories. What are maybe some of the more pleasant memories that you had? Maybe some rewarding moments that you had while being in Korea?
I would travel occasionally, just a little bit, to look at the rest of the island. And I went down to the Rycom, where the army camp was, a time or two.
Mm-hmm.
And I enjoyed my traveling over there. There were some people, some women there that I got acquainted with that were going to college or school on Okinawa, and they were from a neighboring island. And those people learned fast, but they were not advanced real well because of they were very poor, extremely poor. And I always gave them more than they charged, for what they did for me, but like I said a while ago, they would only charge you like a pack of cigarettes for what they'd do for you.
Mm-hmm.
And the amazing part about it was that they knew how to make your bed up real tight, and they'd wash and dry and iron your socks and roll them up in a ball and drop them on your bed and they'd bounce. That's how tight they have the bed made up. And they were really good working people and didn't charge hardly anything.
So you would say that the relationships that you had with the Korean civilians and other troops is pretty good relationships?
Had good relationship with them.
In 2013, we witnessed the 60th anniversary of the signing of the armistice between the UN, China, and North Korea. And there's no other war in modern history that has lasted 60 years after an official ceasefire. What do you think that needs to be done to end the hostility, to put a closure on the war finally?
We need to, some way or another, get along with those people. And I'm not a politician, so I don't know what our recourse is, except to say that we do need to make it a point to get along with them.
Would you support a reunification of North and South Korea if it were possible?
I believe I would.
Do you think it could be possible?
I think it could be. I compare to some degree our civil war that we had here, North and South,
Mm-hmm.
and how neighbors fought neighbors, At some point, north of the Mason-Dixon line and south of it, they were against each other. And having a situation like that doesn't heal itself is a very bad situation, because you've got relatives killing relatives
Yep.
when they don't unify. And some way or another, I feel like that North Korea and South Korea need to try to mend their problems and get along.
Mm-hmm.
I appreciate the privilege to come down and talk about it. But,
We definitely appreciate you being able to come down here and talk about it and to
been
taking
my-
time out of your busy schedule. We really do appreciate it, and we thank you for your service tremendously.